Thanks everybody for coming and taking some time out of your weekend to chat about software engineering. So by a show of hands, who has ever been asked the question, how long do you think this will take, or when will this be done? All right, so almost everybody, which is great. So I've been asked that question a few times. I've been writing software since I was a kid. I shipped my first commercial software when I was 15 years old, co-founded a software company in the States, built it up to a $10 million software company. And now what I do is I'm the president and COO of Ascendle. And just a very brief commercial, what we do is we take business requirements and we create commercial grade software. So we help software companies get their projects done. So I get asked that question a lot. So when do you guys think this will be done, or how long do you think this will take? We cover the full product life cycle. The software that we've built has won some awards, including first place winner of the $50,000 first prize. And finally, we've been excited to have 100% year-over-year growth. So that's all the commercial I'm going to do. So when we talk about estimating, it's oftentimes in the context these days of agile. And agile has a few different benefits. So one is flexibility. So we can start out with a general plan, but then we can change things along the way and respond to change. So the business leaders come to us and say, well, you know what, things have changed. I've heard from my customers, things need to be different, and can we make some adjustments? And we release when we're ready. So we have our sprints, and we're doing our demonstrable software, our shippable product increments, for those of you who are familiar with Agile, and we show it to the stakeholders, and they say, yes, I think that we can show this to our customers, or we show it to our users, and they say, yes, I think we're going to buy this now. But we have some stakeholder requirements as well. So the stakeholders want predictability. So they want it both ways. They want to be able to change at any time, but they want things to be predictable as well. And why? Because they need to plan ahead. So whether it's they need to schedule a marketing push or tell their sales team what's going to be going on, they need this benefit of releasing on a schedule. So what I'm going to talk about today is how to merge these two things together. How to remain agile while at the same time giving our stakeholders those answers that they want. So they need to know, well, what if we add a feature? What is that going to mean? What if we need to adjust how this feature is going to work? So the sales team has shown some ideas to the customers, and they've given us some feedback that says, well, I need to make that a little bit different. And the other thing the business leaders need to know is, well, from a budgeting perspective, what happens if I move the needle by changing the team size? Maybe we're just getting into a new project and we have some flexibility. Can we put 3 people on it? Maybe we can put 5 people on it. What's that actually going to mean? And what happens if we use a different technology? So maybe we're getting some pushback, or maybe because of some business reasons, we're looking at, instead of developing it on this technology, they come along and say, you know what? We've been talking and we think we want to develop it on the Salesforce platform, which is a very common question these days. What is that actually going to mean? And usually with Salesforce, in my experience, it means it's going to take longer and cost more. So what I'm going to talk about today is this process where we're going to define our scope using user stories. And just by a show of hands, how many folks have been doing agile development and are familiar with user stories? By a show of hands. OK, so about half of you. So that's great. So some of this may be a little bit remedial for you, but I'll keep it light for those who haven't seen these before. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to estimate using what we call relative size. And we're going to use this technique called story points, and I'll explain all these as I go along. Then we're going to track what the team can actually get done. And we call that velocity. Velocity is, all right, how much can this team actually get done in a certain time frame? And then we're going to predict by creating a forecast. We're going to use that evidence of how long this, or how much this team can get done over a certain time period. And then we're going to use that to forecast out the amount of time. I should point out, by the way, that these slides are available. If you go to the mobile app, you can download a PDF of these slides. And let me know if you can't find those after the presentation. So what's the result? So those of you who use Jira might be familiar with this. This is called a version report. And what it does is it takes what we've actually been able to do with our team, takes the scope that we have left, and predicts out some time frames. And it now starts to answer that question, well, how long do we think this is going to take? Now notice that we actually need to do some work to find out how fast this team can go before we can start predicting those dates. I'm going to talk about, well, how do we address a project that hasn't yet started? So we have a predicted completion date of 26 January, an optimistic date of 13 January, and a pessimistic date of 10 February. Equipped with this, we now have what we need to satisfy those stakeholder needs, because they now have the answer to that question, how long do you think it's going to take? More important, it's not based on feelings. Well, the team feels like it's going to take this long. Business stakeholders see right through that and they say, all right, if the team feels like it's going to take 3 months, I think it's going to take a month and a half. I don't know if anyone has ever had that experience. So that's the end result that we have once we start using this process. So let me talk about the first step, which is writing user stories. So essentially what user stories are compact and lightweight requirements. It allows us to capture that to-do list of what our system actually needs to do. What I really like about user stories is they're fast. It's not something where we have to go and create a 400-page document for a 6-month project, and we spend 2 months creating a 400-page document. What's also important about user stories, it allows us to create a shared vision. So it's specifically written in a way that stakeholders can understand as well as the team can understand. So it helps to bridge that gap between the business stakeholders and the technical team, because one of the biggest risks to software projects is a mismatch with requirements. You said you wanted X, and I thought you meant you wanted Y, and there becomes this big disconnect between what actually gets built and what the stakeholders actually want and need. The final piece here is the list of user stories, which we call the product backlog, is prioritized by business value. And this is really important, because at the end of the day, the business needs should drive the priorities of the development team. The development team shouldn't be driving the list of priorities unless the development team also happens to be tied into the business needs. So by using this technique, we always can connect the efforts of the development team with what's important to the business. I don't know about you, but there's nothing worse than sitting down and spending 6 weeks building a feature only to deliver it to the business stakeholders and them saying, that's not what I wanted. Well, how did we get off this path? So here's an example user story. And throughout the rest of this presentation, I'll be using a fictitious e-commerce shopping site. User stories are written in a very specific format, and they very quickly and compactly capture 3 really important pieces of information. First is, who cares about this? So what actor or persona or whatever you want to call them, what role in the system cares about this particular feature? And in this case, it's a shopper. The next piece of information is, what do they want? And in this case, they want a gift registry. And then the final piece of information is really important. Why do they want it? And that's the last piece here. So this compact format delivers more value to development teams than I've seen over the years with the traditional requirements, because the traditional requirements spell out in excruciating detail exactly what the system will do, but it doesn't always say, well, who wants it and why? Now, based on the format, that may or may not be true, but this very quickly gives you that information. What's also important about this is that as you work with business stakeholders and they're forced to think through the question of, well, who wants this and why, you can start to find out that sometimes they don't actually know. So they may say, well, wait a minute, I don't really know why we need this feature. And so that can help the process as well. The other part of a user story is what's called conditions of acceptance, or also known as acceptance criteria. This is what I would call the checklist of, well, how do we know when we're done? And they look like this. So with my gift registry, I can create one or more of them. I can add a product. I can specify a quantity. I can look at it. I can share it. And I can remove it. So again, very lightweight here, but it's giving us that checklist. So saying to that business stakeholder, if I produce this for you, what's the checklist, or what are the checklist items that you'll use to verify whether or not you're going to be happy? And again, this starts very lightweight. These 2 components, the name of the user story in that very specific format, and these conditions of acceptance or acceptance criteria, will then expand into acceptance tests, they'll turn into unit tests, etc. This is the starting point. Depending on the type of software that you're building, it may expand to larger and smaller types of artifacts. If we're building medical software that's going to control a radiation device in a hospital, then this is probably going to expand into that hundreds of pages of specifications. But it all starts with this very high-level talk or discussion with the stakeholders about what do I want. So the important thing here is that, as with Scrum and Agile, there's no specific engineering process that's being defined here. But what it does do is it gives you this standard format and this standard approach to make that connection. And then finally, I can rename my registry. So what we do is we take these user stories and we collect them into a list that we call the product backlog. And again, this product backlog is our to-do list, and it's prioritized by the business stakeholders. The development team is not prioritizing the backlog because the development team is focused on what's the best way to execute on this business vision. The business needs to prioritize, well, what's important to the customers, and in a commercial environment, well, what's going to generate revenue? And here's the user story that I was just talking about. So this is the collection of a fictitious e-commerce site that we're going to build. So the next part is we need to estimate the user stories. And there's lots of different ways to estimate. Some folks sit down with the team and say, all right, let's break all these things down into tasks and say it's 8 hours here and 2 hours here and 6 hours here. We're going to talk about a little bit of a different approach, which actually solves a lot of the problems that happen when you do break things down into tasks. So when we break things down into tasks and then we put an hour estimate on it, it's estimating with what's called absolute size. It's 4 hours, it's 8 hours, it's 10 hours. So estimating with absolute size is sort of like saying, how many milliliters or ounces are in this cup? Humans are very, very bad at absolute estimation. I have no idea how many mLs are in that cup or ounces. But we're really good at estimating relative. So now we can talk about, well, relative to each other, how big are those cups? Much different. Absolute versus relative. So let me just talk briefly about story points, and then I'll revisit that concept of absolute versus relative estimation. So story points is an abstraction of size. And why do we have this story points concept? It's actually specifically to get away from this concept of estimating in hours. Because if you say hours, you immediately think absolute size. If I say story points, well, what's a story point? It doesn't mean anything. Story points mean nothing except for the relationship between the different sizes. And these are the only sizes that we're allowed to use. And this is what's called the Cone scale, after Mike Cohn. Mike Cohn's one of the early guys involved in Agile and Scrum, and he now runs Mountain Goat Software. If you haven't read any of Mike Cohn's stuff and you're interested in Agile and Scrum, I highly recommend him. So he came up with a scale which is very similar to a Fibonacci sequence. And the reason you'll see that as the sizes get larger, the distance between them grows. And that's because as we get into larger user stories, into larger features, the amount of uncertainty is going to change quite a bit. So what this is designed to do is that when I put these into a list, when I estimate my user stories and combine them into a list, there's a plus or minus 50% margin of error in between each of those. So if I'm off by 50% plus or minus, the errors all even themselves out. Because some of the 8s really should have been a 13. Some of the 5s really should have been a 3. Some of the 20s really should have been a 13. So if I have that plus or minus 50% and I put them in a list, they all cancel each other out. If I just have one user story and I say it's a 13, you can't really take that to the bank because there is that plus or minus 50% margin of error. But when I put it into a list, it becomes really powerful. So let's revisit this relative size. So how do we do this? Well, let's just say for argument's sake, I'm going to make that a 1. So now I can look at this and say, well, is that a 2 or a 3 or a 5? And now it becomes a lot easier. Well, I'm going to say that's a 2. And well, what about the next one? Well, let me call that a 3. And let me call this last one a 5. If I asked you to determine how many mLs or ounces were in each of these, we can't do that. Humans can't do that. But we can very easily and quickly do this. And this is the entire concept of story point-based estimating. And it's amazingly fast and it's amazingly accurate. And it eliminates all the problems of absolute size. A, we're terrible at it. And B, there's another problem with absolute size. If you say it's going to take 8 hours, that's your 8 hours. For me, it might take me 20 because the technology is unfamiliar to me, the domain is unfamiliar to me. You've written these types of applications 14 times before. So for you, it's 8 hours. Yeah, no problem. And then you might say, well, this is 2 hours. And for him, it might be a half hour. So the problem with absolute size is it's also very dependent on the individuals who are doing the estimating. When we get into relative size, all that goes away. Because what we've done here is we've disconnected time from size. And I'll show you how we bring those two back together at the end. So what are our goals of this estimating process? First, we're going to leverage the team experience. We want the experience of everyone on the team. We want both of these guys' experience, because collectively we're going to be able to understand the problem much better. The other thing about this process is it encourages discussion. So what it prevents is there's a couple of guys over here throwing around well, it's probably a 1, it's probably a 2, or it's an hour, it's 2 hours, and I'm thinking, I've done this before, and this is like 2 weeks worth of work. But I think these guys have been at the company for 16 years. They must know what they're talking about. There must be some secret sauce that they have. But as it turns out, they don't. They just don't know what the hell they're talking about. So this discussion is really important. It also involves everybody. Everybody is actually required to participate, and I'll explain why in a minute. And there's also making it democratic. So the folks that have been at the company for 16 years don't just sort of dominate. And I've been there for 2 weeks, and I'm sort of, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut so I don't get in trouble. This process actually eliminates that, because I have a lot to bring to the table, even if I've been in the company for 2 weeks. So how do we do this? We use what's called planning poker. And it sounds a little bit funny if you haven't been introduced to it, but we use these cards, and we actually go through the process of estimating each of these. So what do we do? First, we discuss the user story and the acceptance criteria. So we talk about, all right, what is this, and why do we need it? There's always a representative from the business embedded into the team. Those of you who are familiar with Scrum, that's the product owner. The product owner is the representative of the stakeholders, whether it's the business leadership, the users, a combination of both. And they're the ones who are answering these questions. Incidentally, they're not allowed to estimate. So sometimes you have an overbearing product owner who just wants to say, well, I know you guys said that was a 13, but let's make it a 3. And all of a sudden they come out with the answer that they want to show to the business as opposed to the right answer. And so the product owner is not allowed to estimate. So you talk about it, and then you vote. What you do is you actually take one of these cards, and you say, all right, well, I think that's a 3, and I put it down in front of me face down. And then everybody else does that. So that's the democratic part. Everybody takes a card and puts it face down, and I can't see what everybody else has voted. And then as soon as all the cards are put down, we say, all right, let's go ahead and flip them over. And we flip them over, and we talk about it. So let's say that we have 5 people, and there were 4 3s and 1 8. So we say, all right, Billy, you put down an 8. Why did you put down an 8? And he might say, well, to do this, we're going to need to do this, 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 and this. And then one of the 3s might say, all right, well, why did you put down the 3? Well, we already built that 3 months ago for this other project. I know exactly how it's going to work. And maybe one of the other 3s says, yep, I totally understand what John's talking about, and we're good to go, I think, a 3. So the person who put down an 8 could then say, okay, I didn't know that. That sounds great to me. Let's go ahead and re-vote. And now the guy who had an 8 will put down a 3. Sometimes what happens is that there's some discussion, and one of the 3s turns into a 5. Oh, wait a minute. Why did you just change your 3 to a 5? Well, I just remembered that what you said is you wanted this. We haven't built that part yet. So we're actually going to need to build that part. It's going to make it a little bit harder. So what this does is a couple things. One, it engages the development team. I don't know how many estimating meetings you guys have sat in, but at some point in that estimating meeting, your brain sort of goes over here, and you kind of stop paying attention to what's going on. It forces you to engage. As soon as you're going to be asked to put down a vote, now all of a sudden, well, I better pay attention because someone might actually ask me why I put down that 3. So I better be ready to explain that I actually knew what it was that you were talking about. And again, it encourages that discussion and this group. So there's been studies done that show that the degree of accuracy when estimating as a group is dramatically higher than just an individual estimate. So if I sat down and estimated everything, it's going to be much less accurate than if I sat down even with a couple of other folks who knew what were going on with what we're going to build and did that estimating. So now what happens is our product backlog gets our story points assigned to it. So we repeat this process for each of our user stories. There's one other side benefit besides just this deliverable of the story points, which in this case total up to 70. The other side benefit is that as the team is discussing these user stories, they're actually getting their brains around what it is that we're going to build. So now over the course of the next few months as we're building it, you've pre-programmed the entire team's subconscious to understand what it is we're building, and your brain is actually sort of processing that all the time. That's much different than, well, the business analysts are going to go over here for a couple months, they're going to write the spec, and then the team gets together and on day one of production, they dump the spec in our laps, and we need to absorb it immediately and start cranking it out. And I don't know about you, but who has ever had the problem where you've written some code or you've had your team write some code and it didn't actually match the spec because you didn't quite understand it? By a show of hands. Anyone ever have that happen to them? Yeah, a few people. So it engages the team much earlier and more consistently all the way along. So there's our size, there's our estimate, and now what we're going to do is we're going to carry that forward. So before we can calculate how long it's going to take, we need to estimate velocity. And what is velocity? It's essentially just like a car. How quickly can the team move? And how we measure this is coming back to our story points. It's story points per sprint. A sprint being a fixed iteration of production. So typically 1 to 2 to 4 weeks. We happen to use 2-week sprints. So every 2 weeks, we can produce X in terms of story points. And there's a very specific measure. It's shippable user stories. It's not, we almost got these 4 user stories done, and those total 20 points. It's we got these 4 stories completely done, including all of the standards that we require to ship, which is going to vary. So medical software, that's going to have one requirement for shipment. If it's a startup and they're just trying to get something, an MVP, minimum viable product out the door, that standard is going to be a lot different. Maybe I need to have end user documentation. Maybe there is no end user documentation. But whatever's required to actually call it shippable has in fact been done. Because if you don't enforce that standard, then you're not really measuring what it's going to take to really make this happen. But we haven't started the project yet. How am I going to know how fast this team can go? It's a lot easier when you have the team cranking along and you can see what they're actually doing. But let's talk about how we will sort of predict what's going to happen. We have 3 different options to do that. One is we can in fact say, you know what? We're just going to run a couple of sprints with this team and start to see what they can produce. Because there's never been a combination of this specific team with this specific set of requirements on this specific technology. And that's really the problem with software. It's never been done before. Whatever you're doing, it's never been done before. No one has actually ever done this before. So the guys who go and build a building, you know, they've got it easy. We've got it really hard because we're always creating something brand new. The second one is comparing it to a prior project. That's okay. The problem is that now you come back to, was it the exact same team, the exact same technology, and the exact same business domain? And the third thing that you can do is to actually take a few of those stories and sit there and actually now do that absolute estimation. But we're not going to absolutely estimate the story. We're going to break it down into discrete tasks and do those estimates as a group now that we understand what the story means. We tend to use this third one because it is often the most expeditious, because in our world, people aren't typically saying, yeah, just go ahead and start the project and then tell me how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. So we really need to figure out, well, how fast can we actually move this? So the first thing we need to do in order to do this technique is to figure out, well, how big is the box? And what I mean by that is what is the capacity of the team in terms of how many hours per sprint they can spend working on this project. So I've got a group of 5 folks, and I figure out, all right, how many hours can you actually dedicate to this project? Some folks might be distracted by other projects. Maybe they actually can't work full-time on this project, even if it's the only project that they're working on. So I figure out, how much time can you spend? All right, you can spend 7 hours every day. You can spend 7 hours a week. That's great. We'll take whatever we can get from you. And then we're going to subtract our meeting time. Those of you who are Scrum fans, these are ceremonies. We don't say meetings in Scrum world. Sprint planning, daily stand-ups, etc. So again, the capacity here is the time I can actually focus on the project, subtracting off everything else I might need to do for my job. And then I'm going to subtract off any of the Scrum ceremony time that we're going to need to run the project. And that result is our net capacity. So this is the time that we can actually spend heads down working on the tasks in the sprint. So now what we can do is we can do this fine-grained estimating. We happen to have a rule that no task can be larger than 4 hours. And that starts to get away from the risk of, well, this is a 30-hour task. Well, do you really know it's 30 hours? We would tend to break those down into smaller tasks. And they might look a little bit like this, right? And review our acceptance tests, create our user interface views, write our unit tests in code, run our acceptance tests, etc. So we have broken this all down, and we think it's going to be about 12 hours worth of work for this story. We repeat that for the other stories, and then we figure out that given our team size and our capacity, we think we can fit getting completely to done these 3 stories. And I've just sampled some stories off the product backlog. I've taken a mix of small and large stories. You don't want to do a bunch of 2s or a bunch of 20s. You want to sort of mix it up. And so this is what we think we can fit. And so what that has come up to is an estimated velocity of 21. So that's 21 story points per sprint. And this is my estimate for what this team can do. So now we're going to show you how it comes all together. So we've created the list of user stories, our product backlog. We've estimated them using story points. And now we've figured out, well, how much capacity does this team have in terms of trying to predict what it is that they're going to be doing. So how do we calculate a time frame? It's pretty straightforward. So duration is going to be story points divided by velocity. So if I had 21 story points, and that was all that I needed to build, and I can do 21 per sprint, then I think we can do it in about 1 sprint, because that's how much we think we can get done. If I multiply it by the sprint length in terms of the actual times, 2 weeks, 1 sprint times 2 weeks is going to equal, well, it's 2 weeks. So let's take this with our example. So 70 story points, that's what we estimated when we did the story point estimation with our planning poker. And then 21, that's what we estimated we can fit into a 2-week sprint. And that means that it's going to be done in less than 7 weeks. So great, we did this process and we're all done. We're good to go. Right? No? We're not good to go? I'm not going to tell the CEO of the company that we can do it in less than 7 weeks?
Does it always pan out that way?
Does it always pan out that way? That's a great question. No, it never pans out that way. Are you going to have the exact same velocity that you estimated? No changes whatsoever. The CEO is not going to come along and say, Jimmy, I was thinking. I was thinking. The number of times that I've heard that, and I set down my coffee cup, and I brace myself. Whenever the CEO gets thinking, no, it's a good thing, but it can wreak havoc with your schedule. No surprises, nothing that's going to come up. No, this team also is responsible for this other project, and a customer, our key customer just called up and there's a bug, and the team has to drop everything. That's never going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So that's a great question. It never is going to pan out exactly the way you thought. So what do we do about that? We can't just throw up our hands and say, well, sorry, we can't do that. We need to account for that. So what we do is we take a look at the cone of uncertainty. So I don't know if you guys like Steve McConnell. This is a chart from the Software Project Survival Guide by Steve McConnell. I highly recommend it. It's pretty old by contemporary measures, but all the principles still hold true. It's not very agile focused, but it's a great book. And then Agile Estimating and Planning by Mike Cohn, I also highly recommend. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the chart from Steve McConnell and some concepts from Mike Cohn, and we're going to put them the two together. So this is designed around a traditional waterfall-based model. So initial product definition, I have a plus or minus error of 1.6 to 0.6. And then as I move along time and we get more accurate, then the cone of uncertainty shrinks. What Mike Cohn has done is he has mapped this concept onto the number of sprints that this particular team has executed. Again, this team with this product, with this technology. If you haven't done any sprints yet, he says use the widest part of the cone of uncertainty, which is 1.6 to 0.6. If you've run a couple, now you can start narrowing it. Because we've run a couple sprints, we've been cranking away at this for 4 weeks. We start to learn more about how fast we can go. 3 sprints, it narrows further, and then 4 or more sprints, 1.1 to 0.9. He never gets more narrow than that. So 4 or more, you could have run 20 sprints, and you still use the 1.1 to 0.9, so plus or minus 10%. Because even as we're cranking along, there's still those surprises, still those things that come up. So how do we do this? What we're going to do is we're now going to estimate a range. So we're going to estimate a low duration and a high duration. So the first one is, let's take our 70, and now we're going to adjust our velocity. We're going to multiply our velocity by that 1.6. Maybe we were just way too pessimistic on this project. Maybe this is going to come together. Maybe Jane from the other department is going to come along and say, oh, we've built like 30% of that product, and here you go. Not very likely, but it's possible. It's possible that we really blew it. And that can be a problem too. You tell management it's going to take 6 months, and then you build it in 3 months. They're like, all right, well, the next time they say 6 months, I'm just going to assume 3 months because I know that they can do it every time. They're just padding their estimates. And then, of course, the real problem for the business is that you say, oh, shoot, we're tracking for 3 months, guys. Why don't you take the afternoon off? Let's actually slow down. The development team slowing down, it's human nature. We're going to get in trouble if we actually get this done faster. The business does not want that to happen. So if you ever have someone that talks about this, well, you're giving me this big range, say, well, I could just tell you the high one, and then I'm just going to make sure it takes that long. That's going to be a big problem. The CEO is not going to like that. So we adjust the velocity by 1.6, multiply it by our 2, and now it's 4 weeks. The stars aligned. Everything was great. We actually had half the product written, and we didn't even know it. And it's going to be 4 weeks. Now we estimate the high duration. We do the same thing. So we're going to multiply our velocity by 0.6. And again, because we haven't started the project yet. And even at the beginning of the project, we've only run 1 sprint. We'll still use this range. This starts to become a little bit better. Less than 7 weeks. Going to the CEO and saying, I'm going to bet my job on less than 7 weeks is much different than saying it's going to be 4 to 11 weeks. Now, some business leaders and some CEOs will say, 4 to 11 weeks? What do you mean? I can't bet on that. They say, well, that's the best I can do right now. It's the best you can do right now. You cannot estimate any better than this, period. You can't. You don't know enough. So the answer is, well, let me run a couple sprints and I can give you a better estimate. That's the answer. The answer is never, and I've been guilty of this, the answer is never, well, why don't we say it's 5 to 10 weeks? Is that going to work for him? Well, no, that's still not good enough. All right, well, 6 to 9? So, and that's a really important point, and I know I've said it a couple times. I'll say it one more time. You cannot be more accurate than this before you start your project. It's not possible. So what you decide to do with that information is great. What I'd highly recommend is that you give this to your boss. When we quote projects to our clients, we don't tell them the low half of this. We actually slice this in half, and we'll tell them the top half of that. But what we don't tell them is that it's absolutely going to take 6 weeks. So we might actually tell them, well, it's going to be 7 to 11 weeks, because that is the best. We're chopping off the downside. If we deliver on the downside, great for us. We actually happen to do projects time and materials, so it saves them money. Hooray, we're superheroes, we're brilliant, now they're going to give us the next project. But we're always going to give them that sort of range. So once you get that evidence, meaning once you start running the project and the team is actually producing at a certain velocity, then what you can do is you can start saying, all right, now that cone of uncertainty is getting more narrow. And now I can give you that tighter range. It's never going to be better than plus or minus 10%. But the other thing that's really interesting that starts to happen, and we've seen this with our clients, is that you start to get credibility. because you start to demonstrate that we said that we can do this between this time frame, and then you actually do it. And then they say, well, what happens if we add this feature, add this user story? What happens if we take this user story from this and we make it this? And then you actually have some answers. And again, it's not based on feelings or gut feel. It's based on this empirical model. And that becomes really important for the business. And my experience with business leaders is actually, by and large, they don't have a problem with this. All that they want to know is, what is, in fact, the answer, so that I can then plan on that. All right, 4 to 11 weeks. I understand. Tell me, they may want more about, well, how did you come up with this? Is this just feelings, or is this based on a process? And you can actually walk it through them. Look, the 5 of us sat in a room for a half a day or whatever it was, or a couple days, and we went through this process. We discussed all of it, and we used this technique. And this is how we came up with this answer. And now what they can do is they can plan on that, and they can fold that into what's going to be going on. And then, again, as time goes on and you get more accurate, now they can have that information. So I used to be really nervous about giving estimates to the business stakeholders, thinking that, well, they've got this in mind, and they've got that in mind. But by not sort of giving it to them straight, I was actually doing the company a disservice, because the company needed to make plans based on that. I tended to be over-optimistic. I didn't have these tools 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was doing my estimating. And it was a lot of gut feel, it was a lot of sitting down with the team. I got so frustrated about one project that I set the team down 3 days a week for a month straight, and we broke everything down into tasks. And it actually turned out to be pretty accurate, but it took forever. I can't take a month to estimate what turned out to be a 7-month project. So that doesn't work. You can do this process in probably 2 to 3 meetings of 2 hours each for a good-sized project. So for a 6 to 12-month project, you could probably complete this entire process start to finish in 1 to 2 weeks. And not 1 to 2 weeks of working on it 8 hours a day every day, but 2 or 3 meetings a week to get through this. And all the while, you're leveraging the information from that team. So I do have a template that actually helps you walk through this whole process. It has all those calculations built in. And so there's a bit.ly link here. This is also embedded into the PDF download. And so there's also a link in the Excel template to a blog post that I wrote that steps you through the process that we just talked about, actually using that template. It's sort of an instruction manual for the Excel template. And so you have a list of all the user stories. You can put your estimates in. You can make notes about why you put that estimate on, which actually can be really helpful. So as your team is doing some estimating and they put a 13 on there, you may want to put down some notes about what the discussion was with the team. Well, this is going to be tough because we need to integrate with this third-party API that maybe doesn't exist yet, or they're just building it and it's in beta, or we've never touched it before. And so there's some risk here. We thought maybe it would have been a 5 or an 8, but this third-party API, I don't know about you guys, but anytime I hear the words third-party API, I instantly jack up my estimate 1 or 2 notches. And that's it. So I really appreciate your time.